Welcome to the Emotional Eating Unwrapped podcast. I'm your host, Alana Kessler, an emotional eating and weight loss coach for women looking to fall in love with eating, create healthy attachments with food, and lose weight sustainably. Hello and welcome to another new episode of Emotional Eating Unwrapped. I'm your host, Alana Kessler, and today's episode is hitting hard for me today because I'm definitely in one of those places where I have probably been to the refrigerator, to the pantry, um, over 10 times today, just opening it up, closing it, opening it up, taking something out. I have had to lean hard on my skills today to really just ground into what is really going on in my moment to moment life and experience, and just really just walk the talk today, because the episode that we are going to be getting into today is titled, Is It Nourishment or Numbing? Right? We're going to be talking about a nervous system approach to food cravings, to eating compulsion. And I wanted to just share that with you because it's really true that I consider myself someone who's healed from emotional eating. It no longer controls my thoughts. It no longer takes over my life. Um, it no longer has any real impact on my self-esteem and self-worth. However, those days where I am just feel like I'm walking back and forth from the kitchen still happens. And the measure of my healing is my ability to be with myself within those moments and continue to make decisions from my higher self, from a place of clarity, continue to bring curiosity to what's going on, being able to acknowledge that I'm likely in a state of mind and in a state of my nervous system that isn't awesome, right? I don't feel amazing. I'm clearly anxious about something, and, really be able to slow down and move through this time and experience without falling back into old habits. So that's, it's really an opportune time to be recording this episode, because I'm really feeling this type of way within my own life today. So I'm sure that if you are listening to this, you've probably experienced something like this, where you've had a long day, you've had maybe it's been like an overly stressful day with a lot of stuff happening, or maybe it's been a day where not a lot of stuff is happening, right? And there's a lot of space in the day. And you find yourself heading for the pantry, either to give yourself an activity or to finally, let yourself take off whatever mask, whatever role, put down whatever role you've been carrying that day. And, you're not really going to the food because of hunger. And you're not going to the food because it's coming from a place of desire that's adaptive, right? Because we don't always have to be like hungry and starving to eat. Sometimes, we want to eat something because it gives us pleasure, and that's fine also, right? Pleasure doesn't always have to tip over into indulgence and overindulgence. And I think that's also something that, you learn as you're on the healing journey, and as you become more adaptive around food, you realize that you don't always have to be hungry to eat, and eating for pleasure doesn't always have to mean that you've emotionally ate. And I think that that's something that's really important. But for today, we're going to be talking about going to food from a place of wanting to give yourself and give your body something, right? Wanting to give your body an escape from what you're currently feeling. And that can be overwhelm, that can be overstimulation, that could be not enough stimulation, as I said before. And so this is where today's conversation is going to begin. Not exactly with food, but the feeling under the food. Because so many women, obviously myself included, emotional eaters, recovering emotional eaters, recovering perfectionists, recovering overachievers, right? Um, it's easy to, it's easy to fall into that idea that, you're nourishing yourself when you're really numbing yourself. It's easy to think that it's easy to not discern between caring for yourself, like I just said before, where it's like a pleasurable experience, and you're creating pleasure for yourself, or you're checking out, right? You're numbing out. And oftentimes, this really subtle nuance is really important. And food is the substance that this nuance happens with. Okay. Food becomes the portal, food becomes the tool, and food can become the buffer. So let's talk about initially why the nervous system reaches for food to begin with, because we weren't born thinking that food was the only place that we can turn to for safety, for grounding, right? That wasn't something that we weren't born thinking that, right? That was learned. That was a wired behavior. That was something that we were probably, that was something that was repetitive, right? We repeated that. And so, but I do want to say that it is true, though, that as babies, when we were fussy, there was often an oral fixation that was, um, that might have started then, right? Because oftentimes when we were young and we were kids, our parents would give us bottles or pacifiers or something oral that would help pacify, right? That's where the word pacifier came from, that would pacify our distress. And I think what's important is that there is supposed to be a time after you're a child where you learn how to deal with that distress in more healthy and adaptive ways. And you don't use the oral fixation as the pacifier, because I think what's important here is to recognize that it isn't always about the food. It's often about the oral fixation. Okay? And I really want you to start to really start to parse out the difference. And for a lot of women, especially who are in a state of chronic overfunctioning, um, or have spent so many years with a dysregulated nervous system, and then, maybe the nervous system got dysregulated as, maybe the nervous system was dysregulated as like a young child, because babies don't have necessarily, when they were born, we don't have dysregulated nervous systems. We just have reptilian brains with distress. And so, just from like regular, just life, right? Regular biology. And then as you grow up and as you get older, children can start to pattern for dysregulated nervous system. So as we become adults, if we continue on this path and you start to have just this natural pattern of dysregulation where you start being hypervigilant or micromanaging, right? You're managing your home, you're managing other people's emotions. There's a blur between what your actual job is, what your actual responsibility is, and what you think is your responsibility. And that's also where it's really important to start to understand what we have taken on that's not ours. right? What you have taken on that's not yours. Because chaos, emotional chaos, can become really familiar, and we could start to think that that's baseline. We could start to think that that is normal, that that's just how it is. And what happens is when you live in that state of depletion or dysregulation in your nervous system for a really long time, the capacity to hold distress as an adult with all these other responsibilities, because now remember, when we're children, we don't have other things we have to think about. We're very self-centered. But as adults, we're not so self-centered, right? Whether that's, and that's good, right? Because we want to be interdependent. We want to have relationships. We're responsible for stuff. And so what happens is when there's a dysregulation in the nervous system for so long, stress hormones cause a shutdown, right? You get the stress hormones that are chronic causes like a nervous system shutdown, and all that we end up doing is we kind of revert back into that reptilian brain of a child, of a baby, and we just are looking for fast relief, fast dopamine. And food does that. The oral fixation does that. It's both the food and the activity of eating something with your mouth. Okay? And the thing is that though this becomes like an addictive thing, right? It becomes like there is a real visceral need to, it feels really compulsive to eat the food, to take it with your hand and put it in your mouth. Like if you think about it, it's often that type of stuff that we go for. It's not usually like, let's make a plate, let's sit down and have a fork and a knife. It's usually finger food. The issue that's challenging is that food, when we're trying to heal a compulsive, addictive style relationship with food, it's hard because it's legal, right? It's available. And what happens in this cycle is that for a few short moments, as you are engaging in this dopamine releasing behavior, everything, everything feels calm, right? There's like a sense of relief, but it's really only for a very short period of time because it doesn't last, right? It doesn't last because what this experience and situation was, it wasn't a grounding experience. What it was it was an escape. Okay, so let's talk about this for a moment because I want to talk about the difference between soothing, which is what we were doing, what our parents were doing with us when we were children, when we were kids, right? Like babies, and numbing, which is what happens, what it transforms into when we continue doing that as an adult. Okay, so just to repeat that, right? When we were given pacifiers and bottles as babies, we were being soothed. But if we continue to take on that behavior as an adult, we are numbing because now we are responsible for our lived experience. We are responsible. We have that capacity in our brain to, to hold space for ourselves and be, and be emotionally available for ourselves. Whereas babies, we didn't, right? That was the responsibility of our parents. And if we didn't have parents that provided that for us, we can end up in situations like, we can end up in situations like where we're using food to numb. Okay, so the difference between soothing and numbing, soothing is presence, right? It's co-regulation. It's slowing down enough to actually feel your body and respond with care, which is what I just said, right? It's to be with yourself. Numbing is the opposite. It's disconnecting, right? It's frantic. It's chaotic. It's a checked out attempt to override what's happening, override what's true, override a lived experience that you don't have the capacity to, to be with. And that's the line between the two. Soothing is presence and it's co-regulation, which is why when we're babies, we're technically all supposed to be soothed by the parent, the caregiver that's meant to create that for us. But when we're adults, we have to create that for ourselves. And if we're not doing that, it's numbing. Okay, so soothing sounds like, wow, today was a really hard day. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to breathe, I'm going to have something. Maybe it is a food, right? Like I'm going to have something warm that makes me feel safe, right? I'm going to take my time and I'm going to, be with my feelings, and I'm going to intentionally, if it is food, I'm going to be with this decision and choice, and I'm going to make it a pleasurable, regulating experience. Whereas numbing sounds like, I don't want to feel this. It's a reaction response. Like, there's a reaction. I don't want to feel this. I just want to shut it down. I need something in me right now. And so it's numbing when it's quick, when it's fast, when you're eating quickly, when you're standing up, you're standing at the counter, you're scrolling your phone while you're still eating, you're barely tasting the food. You're already like thinking about what more food you're going to eat right after this food because you're already criticizing yourself in your head about this whole thing to begin with, right? Like you're already mad at yourself and shaming yourself for doing this in the first place. And so you're already thinking about what you're going to eat after this, right? Right. So it's numbing because you're already severed from yourself. You're feeling more disconnected and you feel like you're falling more into a black hole, like you're disappearing on yourself again. Okay, so that's the difference. Like soothing is intentional, right? It's warm, right? There's a motivation and an intention of having having a sensual experience, right? Of not escaping, of nourishing, and of being willing to lead with your self-care, with wanting to feel connected and grounded and being able to be with what's happening more. Okay, so this is the distinction, and you want to really understand the energy that's living within you if you find that this type of compulsive eating, this compulsive eating desire is coming up. Get curious about the difference between soothing and numbing. I remember what it felt like to be stuck in the cycle of emotional eating. I tried every diet out there, counting, tracking, restricting, but nothing ever worked. Food controlled my life, my thoughts, and I constantly felt guilty after eating. But once I learned how to heal the emotional triggers behind my eating and trust my body, everything changed. I stopped obsessing over food, the weight started coming off naturally, and I found real freedom in how I ate and lived. So I created the Sober Eating year-long mentorship to help other women experience the same transformation. So you can stop battling with food, you can lose weight without deprivation, and you can feel confident in your body again. In this mentorship, you'll have access to my proven nervous system rewiring method. You'll have access to live coaching with me, weekly accountability, and a community of women who truly understand your journey. You'll also have free access to my signature programs, the Emotional Eating Solution and Decoding Permanent Weight Loss, valued at $2,000. Click the link in the show notes to explore the mentorship today. You don't have to do this alone. I'll be right there with you every step of the way. Okay, so, there are different areas that these patterns can show up, right? And we've discussed it a little bit before, but it can show up either when you're overstimulated, right? Where you're managing everyone else's chaos, right? And you just kind of go straight to the pantry or eating while you're standing up. It can happen if you have a conflict, right? There's friction in your life, with a relationship, with work, right? There's something emotional, friction that's happening that's triggering something within you, and you're just, instead of processing what's happening, instead of letting the flood of emotions or feelings kind of move through you, you just go to the freezer and grab something sweet, right? Or, like we said before, it could be space, right? It's when there's nothing going on. No one needs you. There's nothing for you to do to be productive. And that's when you go to food, and that's when you go to the oral fixation sometimes, right? Of the eating. Right? Not necessarily for the food itself, but for what the eating experience is bringing to you. And so that's the thing here. You want to really recognize that it's not always about the food. It's about what the experience of eating the food. And sometimes it's the food, right? Like sometimes sweetness creates a feeling of warmth inside. Oftentimes when we're having conflicts, relational conflicts, we'll go to something sweet usually because that gives us some of the sweet feeling that we want subconsciously. But a lot of times it's also the experience of eating. Okay, so what we want to do is bring a little bit of curiosity to what's happening here. Okay, so here's a little question that I want to offer you when you're listening to this podcast. And it's a little checkpoint. It's not a rule, it's not a judgment, but it's a little mirror. Okay, and so whether or not you have, whether or not this is something that you do in the moment, typically it'll be something that you ask yourself after the moment. And I really think sometimes it can be hard to be reflective after a binge eating episode or an emotional overeating episode. But really, the ability to reflect with curiosity and receive the feedback to inform your behavior next time, that is the healing work. Those are the reps that you have to do. So it really is in your best interest and in the interest of healing for when you start to feel guilty or when you start to feel shame, instead of falling into the guilt and shame hole, ask yourself, okay, say to yourself, okay, I just did this. And you can feel guilt and shame, and you could feel guilt and shame and still ask yourself this question. And as you start to realize that you have ownership and that you are in control, you'll feel less guilt and shame. That's kind of the paradox of this whole thing. So this is something you can do after an emotional eating episode or a binge episode, or even as you're standing in front of the pantry or the fridge, right? If you have that ability to pause. And that's really where we want to get to, right? And that's where I got to today, right? Where I say, do I feel more connected or less after I eat this? Right? So I'm at the place where I'm very present in my behaviors with food and eating. right? In the moment, in the exact moment. So I'm able to, in the moment, stop and say, all right, am I going to feel more connected to myself or less connected to myself if I indulge, if I engage in this eating? And sometimes the answer is more, right? Like it's not the right answer is not always, I'm not going to be more connected. Sometimes the answer is yes, this is going to make me feel more connected to myself in this portion. I'm going to do it in, there's accountability that I have when I make those choices. So you can do that in the moment. That would be one. Or you do it after, rather than just going down the rabbit hole of blame, shame, and guilt. You say to yourself, do I feel more or less connected to this? And the more times that you say, that you hear yourself say, I feel less connected to myself after this, that's going to be the engine that supports the behavior change. Okay, that's going to be the engine that supports the behavior change. And then you could start to, in the reflective state, when you move out of the blame, guilt, shame spiral, you give yourself some compassion and you say, what do I actually need? Right? And not what's the easiest thing in the moment, right? Not what's the fastest, biggest dopamine hit you're going to get, right? Like that's what the food and the eating thing provides. But you want to ask yourself, like, what do I need? Right? Do I need to call someone, right? Like what do I need to transform the truth of my experience? Do I need to speak to someone? Do I need to cry? Do I need to scream? Do I need to hit the pillow? Do I need to lay on the floor and just close my eyes and just pretend like, I'm in a bubble? That is one of my favorite things to do, right? And just let the experience not have to be resolved. Okay. And let the energy be moved in other ways. That's really, really what's important here. Because like we keep mentioning, a lot of times it's not about the food. The craving isn't about food. It's about connection to self. It's about feeling like you are connected to what's going on with you. And sometimes we need things to help us connect, right? And so if we go back to the baby in the beginning, that was, we had our parents or our caregivers help us regulate our emotional state and then gave us something to pacify and help transform that experience into a different experience. That's what we're doing. Right? But as adults, we need to regulate ourselves, and we also need to have something other than food be that transformer of energy. And that is, that's when you have to say to yourself, what do I need to transform this energy? What is this energy? Is it sadness energy? Is it anger energy? Is it overwhelm energy? Right? And then connect to yourself using a different type of activity. Okay, so if this episode hits close to home for you, I want to remind you, right? There's nothing wrong with craving comfort, right? It's not bad to, turn to food sometimes to help, or to provide transformation, or to provide kind of I don't know if transformation is the right word, but, to provide that partner sometimes in like a difficult emotional experience. That's not a bad thing, right? Sometimes pleasure from food does make things feel good and better, right? But it's that fine balance, right? Where we realize we're not just looking for momentary relief, right? If there's something that's ongoing, if there's nervous system dysregulation that's chronic, that's ongoing, we don't just need relief, right? You need repair, right? And so that begins by making your body a safe place for you to land, right? It's learning the language of your nervous system, right? Bringing curiosity, awareness, agency, responsibility, right? So that you start to use your behaviors and experiences as invitations to learn more about yourself, and then ask questions of yourself that end up bringing you closer to yourself instead of away from yourself, right? Because this isn't about being perfect. There's no perfect here. It's just about building the capacity to be present with yourself. Because the more that you notice your own patterns, right, the more you soften towards yourself instead of spiral away, it becomes easier to choose true self-care over compulsion, over oral fixation. And that is how we heal. That is how you heal the addictive feeling patterns with food, the emotional overeating. That is how food stops being the only place that you feel you get relief, you get grounding, you get a place to feel okay. That's how it stops being just eating and food, because you start to become that place for yourself. Right? You can become that place for yourself amidst whatever emotional weather is going on, because you're growing that capacity. Okay. So thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you have any comments, please leave them on Spotify. You can also leave them on YouTube. We post all of our video episodes on YouTube and on Spotify. So if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe to us there. You can also follow us on Apple. We are on that platform as well. So thank you again so much for listening. And until next time, I'm Alana, and thank you for listening to Emotional Eating.